Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, AP English, the World of Ideas lecture. We are now in unit number 5, Nature, and this is lecture number 28, Stephen Jay Gould's Non-Moral Nature. It's an essay that he published in Natural History, volume 91, number 2, from 1982. Now, before we move into the last 3 essays of unit number 5 on nature, I just want to make some general observations because, as we have often said in 303, we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, and the stories we reject. That reject part is hypercritical to the next 3 writers we're going to study. Gould here in this lecture. We're going to meet the brilliant Kaku in the next lecture, and then finally Dawkins in the final reading of unit number 5 on nature. Now, it's interesting that Jacobus calls this unit nature and not science, although very quickly we're going to find that these 3 now iconoclasts, you'll remember that term from when we studied Chaucer or when we studied Jonathan Swift, for example, iconoclast, iconoblastic, pick up that aluminum bat and whack against sacred cows, that kind of thing. We're going to see now in these 3 thinkers, starting with Gould, challenges to the traditional way of thinking if one is looking at certain kinds of religious views, or we might call them mythic views, or whatever. But as we've said many times in 303, let's now just repeat that this division that's often constructed between science and religion, and we're certainly going to see it referenced in these titles now that we're about to work with, it's really an arbitrary kind of division. It is a linguistic division. I mean, to do anything religiously just simply means that you do it over and over again. And to that degree, one can do science religiously. Yes? And we talked about myth as the attempt to explain the unexplainable. First in the Greek tradition, up through, we could argue, the modern tradition. I mean, as we have said, we use language all the time in science, objectivist science, that of course we're not really completely sure what we're saying. When we say energy is that which can be neither created nor destroyed, that sounds a whole like what St. Augustine said about God. Interesting. To that degree, as we pick up then these 3 titles, we want to appreciate the iconoclastic, the you need to wake up kind of tone of all 3 of these essays we're about to see. They're definitely combative, they're definitely arguable and argumentative. Most iconoclasts are. But we're not going to run from that kind of thing and be frightened by it, nor are we going to forget that you can be fanatical, epistemologically absolutist, fanatical, in any position, right? When science becomes no longer fallibilist epistemologically, but rather absolutist, I am 100% sure, and you are absolutely wrong if you disagree with me, we stop calling that science often in 303, as we have said, and we call it scientism. But that's no different from any other kind of fanatical position that refuses to hear any alternate kind of opinion, epistemologically speaking. So as we turn now to Gould, a genius, absolute genius, and he's so good at presenting ideas, we hope that we can be challenged. We hope that our ideas can be challenged because that's what we look to do in our conversations here together in 303. But at the same time, we're not going to see this in black-white terms. Go back to our very first text in the World of Ideas. That's why I'm so happy Jacob has selected it for us in this, the 4th edition, because it's the Tao Te Ching. And you'll remember that yin-yang symbol. Remember, it's a circle with an S through the center, not a rigid line. In other words, the distinctions between maybe dualisms, maybe religion and science compete with each other, but if there is any competition, it isn't hard and rigid at all, back to our yin-yang symbol. And to that degree, we're going to look at these essays with an open mind. Think of it this way. Back to Cave Allegory, Plato, Book 7, Republic. The assumption is that people sitting inside of the cave, well, they're believing that the shadows on the wall are real, when in fact the shadows on the wall are not real. That is to say, once the individual exits the cave, epistemologically there's enlightenment, we call it perspicacity, insight, right? But the obvious question is, well, who are the people sitting inside of the cave chained up believing shadows on the wall are real? An extreme position for the scientists will say anyone religious. the extreme position for the religious individual, anyone who is simply scientific. We're going to argue, wait, that's way too simpleton for the world we live in today, isn't it? And we're going to ask some simple questions like, what constitutes proof? What constitutes the proof that the shadows on the wall are in fact just not real, that they're just shadows on a wall? What constitutes that proof? We're going to hear some of this debated now in the essays to come. I say all of this just to kind of set you up. I hope that you're interested now more in the study even than maybe you were before. Now again, there are some assumptions. The first is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, especially in the AP folder, the World of Ideas folder, lectures 1 through 27. We're going to reference, we already have referenced the cave allegory, for example. So if I'm talking about the cave allegory and you don't have a clue what I'm talking about, I do recommend that you go back and take a look at that information first, all right? We also work off of the assumption you're familiar with our learning theory, the desire, and you can already hear it in the tone of my introductory comments here. We're on a quest. We're explorers. We're discoverers. That is to say, we have some fundamental absolutes that we're working with. We have said it. You ain't met no 200-year-old people. We have said it. 2 people had to hook up and exchange fluids to produce you. Those are absolutes for now. Is it possible in 1,000 years that we'll be able to live to 200 years? It is possible. Is it possible that somewhere in the future we'll be able to produce children without 2 people hooking up and exchanging fluids? We know that's also possible. In other words, our absolutes are only absolutes to the degree that they are absolute for the moment. Yes? And to that degree, we're always learning. We're always growing. We're not afraid of ideas. We will engage in any kind of discourse, right? Of course, we know how to draw lines as well. No, you don't get to act like a Nazi. But we will ask why Nazis had Nazi views and why it is that people are so drawn to fanatical absolutism kinds of views. Talk, for example, with an extreme atheist and try to make the defense, for example, of God, and they will often get so fanatical and upset. The same, of course, can be true of a religious believer who is being challenged to try to defend a religious position. What we're trying to argue for, and of course, this is part of our epistemological position in 303, is that fallibilist position that says, I think I'm right about any epistemological position I hold, intellectual position I hold, but I'm willing to admit the possibility I could be wrong. For example, that's why we'll look at some of the essays as we are looking at them so closely, with some hope that we can be challenged. We want to be challenged. Why? Because back to the cave allegory, the only way we're ever going to learn anything is through overcoming fear and pain. It's the only way. The next assumption after our learning theory, of course, is that we will practice this connecting of new information to old information in meaningful ways and in individual ways. Go back to our Howard Gardner lectures on multiple intelligences through our reading, active reading, that is to say annotation, and we will pick up a text to read it actively, to discover, of course, answering 3 guiding questions. What does the text say? Here we're summarizing. At level 1, we are working with that paragraph outlining. At level 2, we'll ask the question, what does it mean, the text? And then finally, how can I relate to it in some way? Now at level 2, what does it mean? We subdivide. At 2A, themes, messages, as well as our big 5. About any one of these titles, just like any other text or story that we work with in 303, we're always asking about the big 5. What does this text say for us epistemologically? That is to say, what does this text say for us about what we can know? That's going to be hypercritical for these 3 essays we're about to see. What does it say about ontology and who we are? What does this text say about psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the collective mind, and then finally, the all-important question, it seems to me, as I present it to you guys, because we live in a real world where there is pain, there is suffering. Why is there pain? What's the point of it all, right? We're going to get some ideas right away. Gould's going to play that game. For example, when you step into the animal kingdom or the insect kingdom, for example, the eknumen is going to be his primary exemplar. What about that in regards to theodicy or existence of evil? At 2B, we don't ask what Gould or anybody else says, but how that's said. That's that rhetorical stuff. We're really going to concentrate on that. Why? Because we're reading so that we can become better writers. Of course, better thinkers, no doubt. Better informed, no doubt. But good writers. That is to say, how does Gould pull it off? We're going to ask that question about all 3 of the authors to come, because all 3 of these authors, Gould, Kaku, as well as Dawkins, know that they are wading into some territory where they will have a lot of pushback. That is to say, what we called in the Declaration of Independence lecture the acrimonious audience. That audience with whom you know is, many of the readers are going to completely disagree with you right away. And again, the goal when we write is to keep the reader reading, right? And to that degree, we're going to study how does Gould, and of course Kaku and Dawkins to follow, how do they pull that off? How do they keep me reading? They can upset me maybe, but not so much that I don't want to keep reading, at least for many readers, okay? If we have what is often referred to as an open mind, which of course, as we have pointed out, is a very strange phrase, because you can't touch your mind. What does it mean to be open or closed? Oh, we're speaking metaphorically. It seems like we do that a lot, of course, when we are studying in religion, but is that also true when we're studying in science? Well, of course, as we have said, energy is an interesting word. Nobody's quite sure exactly what it means. And of course, as we have said before, this notion of consciousness or mind is a very dubious myth, but it's one that we continue to need, right? You have to have a mind to argue you don't have a mind. Finally, at level 3, we ask, can I relate this information to other stuff that I already know? And of course, we're going to ask that about some of our earlier readings. See, what's fascinating in the unit that we have here, Unit 5 on nature, is that our first, Francis Bacon, and our second, Charles Darwin, they both were quasi, at least, believers in some kind of external deity or power. Okay? As we said, Darwin was trained in theology as a minister. He was reluctant to publish some of his ideas because he understood the implications as it related to religious believers, not least of all his wife, as we've said in earlier lectures. With that in mind, we now turn to outright advocates for a more atheistic view, a non-theistic view. And to that degree, we're going to pay attention to the ways that they will approach what they have to say at 3a. And then finally, of course, at 3b. Guys, what's the point of all of this if you don't have some kind of personal response to it? That is good. But in that personal response, as we've always said, how does this relate to me? We want to be respectful, especially respectful of ideas we have not encountered before, or we have encountered before and we were disgusted by them. Those are the ideas we most have to be respectful of because we're trying to appreciate those ideas. It doesn't mean we have to accept them. Certainly we are the stories that we reject. But before we can reject a story, we have to know that story, right? We have made this point politically. Having political conversations, important, but they have to be conversations. They can't be lecturing back and forth. Put two people down that one loves a certain politician, the other hates that politician. Question, can those two people actually converse, communicate, dialogue? Plato says yes, if and only if. Two things. You define your terms and you show proper respect for the alternate opinion. We're practicing that, in fact, as we wade into this Gould essay. Let's now finish with the assumptions. Of course, my hope, and I really mean this, guys, we're into Unit 5. We're obviously beyond even halfway through the Jacobus volume. It really is my hope that you are reading this material on your own and then coming to me to gain some further insights, as I am hoping to hear from you and gain some further insights. Now, let's talk about Stephen Jay Gould and a brief biography. His dates, 1941 to 2002, so just recently passed from us. American paleontologist, evolutionary biologist. He is really a historian of science, and he served that purpose brilliantly. Probably one of the most influential and widely read authors of popular science of his generation. And by popular science, what we mean is he took esoteric ideas and he tried to make them in some way understandable to those of us who maybe don't spend all of our time in the sciences, in the hard sciences. He did spend time at Harvard. He published often in the Natural History Museum, which is where the essay that we're going to be working with comes from. He did win the MacArthur Fellowship Award in '81. I just want to turn to pages 415, 416 in Jacobus, because Jacobus does a fine job of introducing to us this essay called Nonmoral Nature. Nonmoral nature, he says, examines a highly controversial issue, the religious reading of natural events. Gould opposes the position of creationists who insisted that the Bible's version of creation be taught in science courses as scientific fact. Moreover, He views the account of the creation in Genesis as religious, not scientific, and points out that Darwin, who, as we have said, was trained as a minister, did not see a conflict between his theories and religious beliefs. By the way, that line is, of course, muchly debated and continues to be so till today. Gould's primary point in this selection is that the behavior of animals in nature, with ruthless and efficient predators inflicting pain on essential helpless prey, has presented theologians with an exacting dilemma. If God is good and if creation reveals his goodness, why do nature's victims suffer? Notice right away, we are at the question in our big five of theodicy, namely the existence of pain and suffering. Interesting, right? Now to just skip down a couple of paragraphs, instead, just to finish Jacobus's observation, instead of an anthropomorphic, human-centered view, Gould suggests a scientific view that sees the behavior of predators as sympathetically as that of victims. In this way, he asserts that the ecnomen and nature will be seen as non-moral, and the act of predation, that is to say to be a predator, seen as neither good nor evil. The concept of evil, he says, is limited to human beings. The world of nature is unconcerned with it, and if we apply morality to nature, we see nature as merely a reflection of our own beliefs and values. Instead, he wishes us to conceive of nature as he thinks it is, something apart from strictly human values. Now, this is a compelling idea, but I want to point out right away, we are now entering into an activity that I think is very beneficial. For many of you, Gould's going to present an argument you haven't really maybe thought very much about. Now, your instincts may be to get upset and fly from the argument. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But I'm going to challenge you. Stay with him. Hear what he has to say. Work through it. Now, let's talk really quickly about Gould's rhetoric. Clear, direct language. You're going to see this right away as you begin to read it. I'm going to challenge you to pay attention, though, more than anything, to the tone of this essay. Tone, right? When you come in 3 in the morning, your mom asks you, where have you been? And you go, where do you think I've been? She goes, don't use that tone of voice with me. It's not the words you say, it's how you say them. And I want to point out that Gould's tone is almost tongue-in-cheek and humorous at times. Why? Well, I think he realizes that he is treading on some ground that a lot of people will find offensive, or at least troubling, if not offensive. Just to finish what Jacobus has to say on 417, instead of using a metaphor to convince us of a significant fact or critical opinion, Gould deconstructs a metaphor that was once in wide use, that the animal world, like the human world, is ethical. He reveals the metaphor to us, shows how it has affected belief, and then asks us to reject it in favor of seeing the world as it actually is. Sounds very Platonic, doesn't it? Although maintaining the metaphor is inviting and can be irresistible, Gould says we must resist it. Gould also makes widespread use of the rhetorical device of metonymy. Now, let's put this one in our notes. This is a new one maybe for a good number of us, although we've spoken about it before in AP, when, for example, in Hamlet, in Act 1, at the very end of the play in Scene 7, when the ghost king of Hamlet says to his son, know this, the serpent that did sting me now wears the crown. This is what we call metonymy, in which, now to define metonymy, a part of something stands for the whole. Metonymy. Okay? Thus, the details of nature, which is God's creation, are made to reflect the entirety, which is God. Therefore, the behavior of the ecnomen comes to stand for the nature of God. And because the ecnomen's behavior is abjured evil by those who think that animal behavior is metaphorically like that of people, there is a terrible contradiction that cannot be rationalized by theological arguments. Okay, just to finish, Gould shows us just how difficult the problem of a theologian is. Then he shows us a way out. But his way out depends on the capacity to think in a new way, a change that some may not be able to achieve. Again, go back. Now you'll understand why already we started with the cave allegory. It is altogether possible when we meet new ideas, controversial ideas, challenging ideas, iconoclastic ideas, that our first instincts are to say, I got no interest in this. Our argument is, listen to the argument and hear what it is that Gould has to say. And then you can make your decision one way or the other. Let's work now at level 1 really quickly, and we'll go through the 29 paragraphs. Paragraphs 1 and 2. He says, the most pressing problem of natural theology in the 19th century was as follows. If God is benevolent, kind, and generous, compassionate, and creation displays his power, wisdom, and goodness, quote unquote, then why are we surrounded with pain, suffering, and apparently senseless cruelty in the animal world? This is one of the age-old questions, as we have said. Our study of Milton's Paradise Lost has shown us this, right? The question of justifying the ways of God to men. Why is it that there is evil in this world, and among the animal kingdom as well? To continue, William Buckland, he says, considering carnivores to be at the center of this problem, concluded that being killed and eaten spared victims the greater anguish of disease, injury, decay, and starvation. Therefore, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. Paragraphs 3 through 7. Worse than predation, however, is slow death by parasitic ingestion, which is the modus operandi of the ichneumon fly. The ichneumons and related wasps compose perhaps hundreds of thousands of species. The female lays her eggs inside or on a caterpillar, aphid, spider, or other host, sometimes paralyzing the victim at the same time. When the egg hatches, the larva eats the still living host slowly from the inside out, destroying the organs necessary for life to last. This is, of course, the science component of Gould's essay, paragraphs 18 through 16. The struggle between wasps and hosts recalls human battles and tortures. We immediately think of Homer's Iliad, don't we? Or Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, for that matter. Sometimes the host struggles and escapes, but the ruthless efficiency of the parasite is most impressive. The wasps use various ingenious strategies to outwit their victims, and they strike early, some parasiting an egg rather than a larva or an adult. Quick, one species can deposit up to 72 eggs in a single second. And often, some lay their eggs in mini victims or produce eggs that divide into mini larvae. The wasp offspring are as efficient as their mothers, eating every edible morsel of the host and sometimes using its shell as well. In other words, efficiency within nature. Why is that? Not constituted as good. Why is it